Hello, this is Tana from Proverbial Homemaker, and today I am sharing with you my favorite math curriculum that we have used in our homeschool, which is Christian Light Education Math. And this is a curriculum that we picked up early on at our very first homeschool conference. We've been using it for over 10 years. We use it every single year. And even though we've used different curriculum throughout the years as well, we often end up landing with Christian Light Education Math, or I usually call it CLE Math for short. We really love it. So I'm going to give you a peek into how we use it in our homeschool and the reasons why we enjoy it and how to kind of adapt it for your kids if needed. We've used Christian Light Education Math with my oldest since he was in the first grade, and now he'll be going into the 11th grade this coming year and using their Algebra 2 curriculum. So we have a lot of experience with it, and different kids in our family have used it at different points. We have different abilities in our family. And one of the things I love about CLE Math is that it's very simple and effective in its design. You get, for each level of the math curriculum, you get a series of work texts or workbooks that are relatively short. The kids really enjoy getting to the end of it. They have this sense of accomplishment with the end of each workbook, and there are 10 workbooks in each level. So they, are motivated to finish those and do well in them. They don't include a whole lot of bells and whistles or, distracting color pictures or anything like that. They're just very simple and effective, and we really enjoy it. I also like that it teaches concepts in these bite-sized increments, and that helps to prevent my kids from getting overwhelmed, and it also helps to kind of help them learn things at a mastery level. So even this is a spiral curriculum, and as far as its, how it does review, it uses systematic daily review with a spiral approach, and that helps them really master and retain the information ongoing, and they're going to pull in past concepts that they learn to practice. But for each lesson, they're going to get this bite-sized incremental approach to teaching new concepts. And I really like that. It really helps my kids to avoid getting overwhelmed by too many new things. They learn this one new little piece, and then they get to review what they've already, learned before. And that is a really effective approach for us. Like I said, it uses a workbook format, so each workbook is relatively short. It's 17 lessons in each workbook, and that includes 2 quizzes and a test. And the funny thing is, a lot of times I will suggest to people if they're trying to zoom through it, because you might have reasons to do that, and I have at different points too. I'll say, well, just skip the quizzes. But my kids actually really like the quizzes because they're shorter than normal lessons, and I don't know, they just feel like they accomplish something when they do the quizzes. So often they'll want to do them anyway. But they really enjoy that workbook format, and that's my oldest. It's his favorite curriculum. We've dabbled with a few other curricula over the years, and he's like, nope, I want my CLE Math. That's what I prefer. So, he really enjoys it, and he's kind of a mathy kid, so he really enjoys math, or I should say he does really well at math. I'm not sure he enjoys it all the time, but he does a really good job. One thing I really like is that the CLE Math curriculum will teach using daily life facts and, characters and examples and stories that are very practical and God-honoring and wholesome. So many of them will, build up your kids' character. They'll point them to the Lord. They'll point them to family values and things like entrepreneurship and character traits like being diligent and things like that, just kind of woven lightly throughout the entire curriculum. And so I really appreciate that as a homeschool mom. It just sort of, reinforces the things that I'm trying to teach them. And of course, one of the main things I love about CLE Math is that it can be adapted to our needs to fit our homeschool and to fit each individual child. So at different points in our homeschool journey, we've had a kid who maybe needed to go a little faster in the curriculum. Like maybe we, took a long break off for a new baby, or, a death in the family, or a move, or, I don't know, we were just struggling for some reason to not get our math done. And so we wanted to kind of get them back up to where we wanted them to be. And I'm kind of a big fan of you don't need to worry about being behind. But math is one of those things where I at least try to keep generally, at least within a half year, on track, just so that we don't get too behind by the time we get to high school. By the time we get to high school, I want to make sure that they're on track to finish high school level work at each grade level. So I kind of just keep an eye on that throughout the elementary and middle school years. So all that said, there have been times when we've needed to kind of pick up the pace a little bit. So we might double up lessons. We might do that by crossing off a whole bunch of questions. So if we're working through our workbook and we have lesson 1 and 2, for example, I often, even if we're not doubling up, will cross out the problems if my child doesn't need quite that much review. And because I'm teaching them and homeschooling them and grading their work and looking at their tests and things like that when they get older, I know what they need more or less review in. So I can go in and cross off things as needed. And so I'll go in and cross off things, and maybe they'll double up and do, like, for example, maybe they'll do the new lesson, the new material in the 2 lessons, and then like a third of the practice problems for both lessons, something along those lines. So we do stuff like that to double up and move them along quickly. We'll skip the quizzes if needed, if we're trying to speed things along, and we'll focus on the test to make sure that they're really retaining the information, and then we'll go back and review if needed. So that's one way that we can adapt it if we're trying to speed things up. So also, it helps with the crossing out the questions. If you have a kid that gets overwhelmed, because there are I think there's a really good amount of practice problems in each lesson, because sometimes I have children who actually need to slow down and work on more practice problems. And so what we'll do, I actually have a child in the 3rd grade level right now who's doing that. So each day we actually do half of a lesson. And so for that, they'll do the first 2 pages, and that will include the new stuff for the lesson and then a little bit of practice. And then the next day they'll do the second 2 pages. And even then I'll cross off some of the problems if I think he doesn't need quite that much practice in different areas. But we split it up because he was starting to get overwhelmed with the amount of work that was happening. And it's okay for us to adjust it and go at the speed that fits him at that time, because I know from my oldest that there are going to be times where he needs to slow down, and there are going to be times when we can pick up the pace, and it will all work out in the end. So right now we're doing that with him. And so for those, he gets to the quizzes and he really enjoys them because they're short. So we go ahead and do those, and then we do the test, and we're moving through it just fine. As they start to get into middle school, and actually I'm starting it now with my 3rd grader. I don't know why I thought of doing it so early. Maybe I just really enjoy it with the other kids, is I teach them to start doing some self-checking and self-grading. One thing that really has been useful with CLE Math is, especially if you have mathy kids, but even if you don't, it's just really well done in a way where your child can themselves work through the lesson and teach themselves the content. Now for grades like 1 through 2, I'm sitting there reading it to them, especially depending on their reading level. But I'm sitting there reading it to them and really working through each lesson with them. And that's appropriate for that age range. But starting somewhere around 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, they should be able to start doing that on their own, teach themselves the lesson, do the practice problems, and then somewhere in that range, that 3, 4, 5 range, or even into more the middle school area, I will start teaching my kids to, instead of me grading their work, I will have them go grade their work. So for example, today, my 3rd grader, like I told you, he split his lesson into 2 different days. So yesterday he did his first 2 pages in the lesson, and then today he went and corrected those 2 with a correction book. And so what I have him do is take the teacher manual, and it will give him the answers, and he'll go circle the ones that he got wrong. And if he knows what he did wrong, then he will correct them after he showed me which ones he got wrong. So he'll bring me his workbook, show me the ones that that he circled that he got wrong, and then he'll go off and do those problems again, and then come back and we'll make sure that he got them right. And then if he gets stuck on one and really doesn't know what to do, then he and I will take time to work together through it and figure out what the hang up is, and then he'll move on to the next half of his lesson. Now for my oldest, when he did Algebra 1, instead of, he had been learning throughout the years how to do that exact process. He would do a lesson, and then the next day, before he did the next lesson, he would go and correct the last one, bring it to me, show me the ones he missed, go work those out, and we'll work through sticking points together, and then he'll do the next lesson. And he did that over several years. And then once we got into high school for Algebra 1, instead of him touching base with me for every lesson, he just touched base with me at test time. So nowadays, he does a whole workbook on his own, corrects it, teaches it to himself. He comes to me if he has any problems, and we work through those together. And then he takes his test, and I grade it. And if there's a problem, if I notice that there's a certain type of problem that he has that he didn't do well on, or if he bombed the test altogether, we know we have to go back and redo the whole thing. But, and there's been some trial and error to that, especially in his 9th grade year, as we kind of ventured into that process a little more stringently. But nowadays, he knows that he has to stay on top of getting his lessons done, actually learning it, understanding it, correcting himself, fixing the problems, making sure he has a solid grasp of the content. And then when he gets to test time, he can zoom right through it and move on to the next one. So that is motivating to him. So it does take some trial and error, but it's worth it to get them to that point. And I love that CLE Math is set up so that you can start them, side by side in those early years, working through it together with them. And those early years include fun things. There's a lot more manipulatives that you can work in. There's little books that we've incorporated that come with, especially with the first grade one. That's my favorite one because yes, I have to read it to them, but we also get to use the cute little clock and the fun calendar book and all of those kind of things. So you do that alongside with them in their first and second grades, and then in the rest of the elementary and middle school years, you're teaching them how to teach themselves and how to manage their time, how to manage their work, how to be more independent, but still be there for them as a teaching parent when they get stuck on things. And then in high school, they really are a lot more independent, and that's what you want. You want to work them into that area. So we love how CLE is set up for that. It's very flexible in that way. The Sunrise edition of CLE Math is the newest one. So if you go to their website, you'll mostly see all the Sunrise edition of CLE Math. There's a couple as of right now that haven't been updated to that new version, which is what we use. But the older one is still there for geometry and functions and trig. So those two in the high school level, a lot of families will just use those anyway. Those are based on a math course from the Alpha Omega Publications group. But some will switch out to something else and then come back to CLE Math. And that's what we did. So we stick with CLE Math, especially for my oldest, as much as possible because it's so well done. The teacher manuals I wanted to mention, I know I mentioned that a little bit, but it's not just my kids using that to correct their work. I really appreciate the teacher manuals. So the teacher manuals are set up so that you can see all the answers to all the pages for correcting and everything, but there are also a lot of notes and extra teaching tips surrounding it. So when I have a child who is stuck on a certain concept, I don't have to always know all of it already myself. It will give me the support I need to be able to teach that to my kid, or help me find the information I need to be able to teach it to them. And they have a lot of good references in the back. So in the back of the teacher manual, they have some extra tests. So if your child, I mentioned that if they bomb one of the tests and you have to go and redo it again for some reason, then they have some extra alternative tests in the back of the teacher manual that can use. That's super helpful because we have had a few occasions where we need to rely on those. They also have some really good appendices. Just today, my third grader and I got stuck on one where I couldn't remember how to do it, and he couldn't remember where he learned it. And so we went to the appendix for the scope and sequence for the third grade level, and we're able to zero in on exactly where that concept was taught in the whole series, and then go there in the teacher manual, and it will give you exactly the instructions that your child used to learn that concept in the first place, and we were able to go through it again. And so it's just really effective and easy to use. They also have some extra materials that we've used over the years. So they, for example, if you go to their website, they have diagnostic tests you can use. If you're using CLE for the first time and coming from something else, I definitely recommend using their diagnostic test to figure out where your kid lands, because every math curriculum has a different scope and sequence and has different pacing and will teach things in different places. So whenever you're switching any math curriculum, make sure that you're using, some diagnostic tests as you're going into it, so you land them in the right place. And it's okay, when you're doing that, especially if you're moving into CLE, you might have to tell them, because one year we switched, I'll just tell you a little story, a little rabbit trail here. One year we switched over to another curriculum. This was several years ago. And we spent almost a whole year on it before realizing this isn't working. And so when we came back to CLE, we used the diagnostic test to say, okay, where are we here? And we were able to figure out exactly which book we were in, which lever we were in. And we basically it set us back about a half a year. Maybe a full year. I can't remember exactly what, but I think we ended up treating it like a full year and went back to what we would have started with CLE Math for that year that we kind of lost. But it was fine because, like I said, we were able to move through it at their pace, and we were able to double up when needed, and it ended up being no problem at all. But those diagnostic tests were really helpful to figure out exactly where we needed to be. It would have been a shame to try to jump to the next year or the next level and struggle, and have to go back again later. So use a diagnostic test. I like to talk about math in levels rather than grades, just because of that very reason. Because I have some kids that are ahead, in their levels, and some that are behind in their levels. And I don't need them stressing about that or comparing to each other or anything like that. So we just talk about them in terms of levels rather than grades, and that kind of clears that up for us. CLE Math also has fun things like reference charts. To me, they're fun. So I really like the CLE Math reference charts. We have a couple around. If you have kids that have struggled with math facts, CLE, especially in the early years, has a flashcard system that has worked really well for some of my kids. For others, they really needed those reference charts that had some of the extra math facts on there that they could reference, and then over time they would just kind of memorize them naturally instead of looking them up on the reference charts. So that was really helpful to have. Another thing that they have that is really helpful that we've only had to use a couple times, but I'm glad they're there, is they have some skill reinforcement workbooks. So these cover algebra, fractions, ratios, and proportions, and then geometry. And the fractions one is the one that really was helpful to us. So when we had a kid who was really struggling with the concept of fractions, and we kind of just moved on anyway, and later realized we need to go back and build up that understanding and that skill a little bit more, we were able to use those reinforcement workbooks to help us do that without having to go and redo a level of math. So definitely check out all of the different resources they have. They have some very helpful curriculum, and again, you can adapt it to anything that you need to for your kids. Now, I've been asked, do I still use CLE Math? And yes, I still use CLE Math. I'm going to have 3 kids this coming year using CLE Math. I do have some kids that have moved on to different curricula. One in particular, he hit a wall because he had dyscalculia, and we could have adapted CLE Math to his needs, I believe. I kind of started working through ways to do that, but what ended up happening with him is that he was right next in age range to his brother who was more advanced in math, and there became a perception issue there and some discouragement. And so instead of trying to continue that way, we split them into 2 different math curricula. So now, my dyscalculia kid is doing a different math curriculum, and he's doing great with that. And my other kid is doing CLE, and he's doing great with that. So there are reasons. Every family is different. Every kid is different. CLE is very flexible. I think it's worth a try, no matter what, because it is very flexible, and it's also pretty frugal for a level of math to just give it a try and see how it goes. All right, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what a lesson looks like before all the kids come in from their outdoor play. So we have grade 3 math here. You have the light units. Light units, there are 10 in each level, and it comes with, so here's the light unit that he's working on right now. It's 309. And then there's a teacher workbook or a teacher guidebook that I'll show you. And then flashcards. So the flashcards are from grade 1 through about grade 4. And these two, I have multiple kids and multiple levels and all that jazz. So I have multiple sets. You would probably just be working through one at a time. So I have 2 different sets of the addition and subtraction with different markers and review systems. And then right now my 3rd grader is working through these multiplication and division facts. So the way a lesson works is you have your light unit, and at the beginning of each light unit there's kind of a story component. So they read through the story. My boys just especially really liked that story aspect of it. And then there's some charts and graphs here that they're going to be using as reference in later lessons. So they read it, and a lot of times the story problems will kind of connect back to the story. And then for each lesson, so here's lesson 1, you can see they have the things they do at the beginning. So they're gonna, for this one, they count by 8s to 80, practice the M and times 8 flashcards for 5 minutes. That's about practicing their multiplication. Do speed drills on page 1, or speed drill 1 on page 61. I'll show you that in a second. And then they record the score in the graph. And so the speed drills and the flashcards have been really helpful for my kids to learn their math facts really well, especially if we're more consistent. Now, some of my kids, I wasn't as consistent, especially with the earlier kids, and I wish I had been, because later kids, when they were consistent with that, they really learned it well. So I do recommend sticking with that if you can. Okay, so then at the beginning, here's the new concept that they're learning. So they're solving story problems with division. So here you can see there's a piece where it says recite the multiply 8 table with your teacher. And then they work through this. Now my 3rd grader can do this on his own. So he reads through this and works out the problems. And if he gets stuck, we go over it together. And then the second part of the lesson is the we remember. And this is the systematic review of all the other concepts he's learned so far. And at the end, it has some fact focus. Now, this is pretty typical for a lesson. There's 4 pages total. Right now, my 3rd grader has started doing half. So one day he does all of this for the first 2 pages, and then the next day he does the second 2 pages. And even then, in some cases, I will cross out some of the problems because he doesn't need to do all of them. He doesn't really need to do all of them. So I cross out some of the problems in each lesson, even though we're splitting it into 2. And you don't have to cross out problems. It's just one of those things. If you know that they understand the concepts, you can cross out some of them. And these are also really helpful for them to do. It helps them just to get used to it. You don't have to time them. We do tend to. So number correct in 1 minute. So you could just have them go through them as practice, but we go ahead and time them. And then here they'll have speed drill scores. So in this one, it's a line graph, and some of the others, they've had pictographs, different ways of graphing their score results. And it just helps them to see how they're progressing and what they might need more help and support in. So for each unit, there are 2 quizzes and a test. So the test is in the middle, right here. You get to the middle of the booklet, and so in the instructions they tell you to pull out the unit tests and the quizzes. I usually just leave them in there because they know when they get to that that's what they're supposed to work on. So the test is in the middle. This is what they do at the end when they're done with everything. They also have 2 quizzes, and the quizzes are at the end. So they'll go through the first 5 lessons of the book, and then they'll get to quiz 1. And then they'll go through the next 5 lessons and get to quiz 2. And then they'll do some more lessons, and then they'll have the test. And my kids actually like quiz days because they're nice and short. So, but you can skip through them if you're trying to zoom ahead. And then for the teacher book, you would just go to the lesson. So here's 309 here. And so it gives you some lesson preparation drill, working the light unit. To be honest, I don't really use much of these, but it has notes for the teacher. And sometimes you'll get some really helpful tips and ways to teach different things. And then it has each of the worksheets that your kid will be working through with the answers. And then if you get stuck, you can use the math reference chart. We actually purchased the sold separately laminated versions of these for my kids to have on hand and find those really helpful. It has the multiplication charts and all of those if they need extra support. If your kid gets stuck on something and they suddenly realize they don't know how to do one of the lessons, then we have found the extra practice sheets helpful, and they have alternative tests as well if they need to redo a test entirely, which has happened on occasion, not a whole lot. But okay, what I wanted to show you was this, the Math 300 Skills Index. So if your kid gets stuck on a certain kind of problem and neither of you can remember how the book taught it, you can look it up in this appendix, Appendix D in this book, and find that problem type that they need to work on and go to that page and refresh your memory and remember how to do it and then go back and work those problems. So this is an essential part of the curriculum. It's very helpful, whether you're using it to correct or your kid is using it. Very helpful, and I do recommend the flashcards as well. So I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions, and follow my link to my blog post. It has a lot more details about exactly how we use the curricula throughout those age ranges. Thanks so much.